Great to have everyone here today. Our fireside chat today is going to cover the key skills that you can hone to improve your craft. We're going to talk about prioritization, mastering both the big picture and the details, and connecting the two. We're going to talk about interviewing customers. We'll touch on what analytics you should use and how you should approach analytics in improving your product. And we'll talk about the skills about coordination and translating, working with different functions. With that, let's lead into introductions. So let me tell you quickly a little bit about myself. My name's Boduch. I'm one of the founders and the chief evangelist of Pendo. What Pendo is we help companies build software their users love. You might ask how we do that. We do that through capturing product usage and user feedback, and we'll let you communicate in-app to onboard, educate, and guide users to value. So it's really fun being here today, creating content with Dan Olsen for the product management community. It's particularly fun since Pendo was uniquely built by and for product teams. Finally, I hope you all have heard of Pendo. If not, I ask you to check us out at www.pendo.io. With that, Dan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Eric. I'm Dan Olsen. It's great to be here with you and Pendo today for this webinar. I have been working in product management my whole career. Started out with kind of a technical background and moved out to Silicon Valley to go to business school. And that's when I discovered this awesome career called product management. And I asked people where the best place to learn was since I had never done it. So I worked into it for a while and then was a product leader at startups and then got into being a product management consultant where I help out companies, often for earlier stage companies as interim VP of product, but also later stage companies, coaching, consulting, advising, helping them be more lean and adopt more modern product management practices. As it says here on the slide, I wrote a book called the Lean Product Playbook about 3.5 years ago. It's a tactical guide, a practical guide on how to achieve product market fit. And in addition to that, I speak at a lot of product conferences, and I also organize my own monthly product meetup here in Silicon Valley. We have it in Mountain View called the Lean Product Meetup. So I'm very passionate about product management and excited to talk to you about that today.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it. I think our audience is too. With that, just before we kick this off, I wanted to let everyone know that we love questions, as it says on the slide. So feel free to ask questions during the session. There's a Q&A button. It's on your nav bar. Use that button to submit questions. We probably won't be able to get to all the questions, but we're going to try to get to as many as we can, and we'll answer that towards the end of the session. So again, please submit questions. We'd love to hear them, and we'll try to answer questions we don't get to in the session offline. So with that, let's kick things off.
Sounds great.
Let's start with the first thing we were going to talk about, the first category, prioritization. Important skill for product managers. Talk to us about why it's particularly important, Dan.
Yeah, it's really important because, there's no shortage of ideas of what we could do, right? On a product team or in a company, there's a million things we could do. We get ideas from everyone, all employees, devs, designers, executives, PMs, marketing, sales. Everybody has ideas on what we should be doing. Customers make suggestions. We watch competitors and see what they're doing. So there's just so many different inputs into what we could do. And so it's very valuable to have someone that sits in a central position to take all that input and facilitate prioritizing it so that we have a kind of a plan of attack, if you will, so that we know which things to focus on. In isolation, I'm sure everyone's been in a meeting and somebody proposes, hey, let's do that. We should do this one feature. In isolation, any one feature, any one request sounds great. And sure, when you're just focused on the one feature, let's do it, right? Unfortunately, it's all about relative prioritization because there's so many different ideas and we need to take them all together to make sure that we're working on the ones that are going to have the highest value and the highest ROI.
So talk to me about how you like to prioritize, how you approach the process.
Yeah, I view prioritization as a two-step process. And in the first step, I think that basically product management, before we bug engineering for any estimates, it's our job to sort out what do we view just from a business value standpoint, customer value standpoint, what is a prioritization, right? So independent of the scope, we should have an opinion about which things are going to create more value, either for the business, like directly tied to revenue or market share or other goals that we have, or for customer value, which can be a little fuzzier. But we have to have an opinion about, is this better than this or this better than that? And I'm a big believer in rank ordering. Earlier in my career, I saw PRDs and MRDs that would have like 50 features listed, and there'd be like 15 highs and 20 mediums, and 20 lows. And when you've got 20 things at the same level of priority, it just doesn't help people make decisions. So it's okay to have high, medium, low, but within those, you should rank order like high 1, high 2, high 3. So I like to rank order that. So that's the first pass as to how product managers should.
Better than what I saw a lot, right? Which was 40 highs and 2 mediums and 1 low, right?
Yeah, right. And one of my big innovations at Intuit was very high. I added very high to the lexicon. I didn't like having just high, medium, low. But then again, within very high, you got to prioritize. So no matter what, you got to prioritize. So that's the first pass. The second pass then is, okay, now we're going to take into account the effort it's going to take or the resources it's going to take, where you take a ROI, return on investment point of view. And that's where things can change. Something that was really high when you weren't thinking about effort and only focused on value could drop down a lot if it's going to take a lot of effort. Conversely, something that maybe wasn't as high on value as the top couple of items, you realize, gosh, this isn't going to take much work, and it can pop up. So that's where you want to have some kind of estimate of value, a return, some estimate of investment. And then I think it's helpful to visualize and just plot it. And in my book, the Lean Product Playbook, there's 2 different approaches. You can get very quantitative. You can come up with numbers for these things. Like say you can try to estimate the revenue impact of all your ideas. Then you can use a number, right? Either dollars or something for revenue dollars it's going to drive on the y-axis. And you can use a number. Usually it's pretty easy to get investment estimates as far as dev weeks or dev months, people months, things like that. And it's not going to be precise, but you could try to do numbers. The other thing you can do is sometimes people get tripped up on the numbers, is just do like high, medium, low. High, medium, low, high, medium, low, high, medium, low, and you end up with like a 3x3 grid, and you just put each idea on a sticky note and put it in the quadrant that it corresponds to, right? Or the sector that it corresponds to. If you want to do very high and do 4x4, you can do that too. But what that helps you do is separate the ideas that, that are worth doing versus not worth doing. And what you end up with is hopefully some high highs. Like, yeah, this is high return, but it's also a lot of effort. And some mediums. Hopefully you get some high mediums, high return, medium effort, or high return, low effort. Those are great. But a lot of times you end up with some ideas that all are good ROI, but some have bigger scope and some have smaller scope. And that's where you eventually kind of need to take a portfolio approach and say, okay, we're not going to do like 10 small things. We're going to do, 5 or 6 small things, 1 or 2 medium things, and 1 high thing scope wise across the board to for what we're going to do to try to improve the ROI.
Awesome. So one of the things I saw, right, we did this study with Product Collective, and we looked at, where, looking at, say, high priorities, medium priorities, low priorities, but where that information, where those priorities were coming from. And there was a lot of competitive priorities, like product managers are spending lots of time thinking about the competition and less time thinking about, what you talk about in things like delighters and differentiators, right? How do you help, or how do you instruct product managers to think not only about, high priorities, low priorities, level of effort, but also who it's important to? Are you building something to catch up to the competition? Are you building delighters? How do you balance that?
Yeah, I think we've all seen companies that devolve into a feature checklist state of affairs, where it's like, oh, competitor X on their marketing collateral, they've got this grid and these 10 features. And so we've got to go and match those. And you get to this feature war escalation. And like I like to point out in my talks in my book, features are solutions, and it's easy to get trapped in solution space. I just gave a talk at Mind the Product, which Pendo sponsored in July, where I really focused on the problem space for solution space. So one way is just to make sure you don't fall into that feature trap, the solution space trap. Always keep your mind on how is this creating value for the customer in talking about customer benefits. So I think benefit-focused comparison grids are way better than feature-focused comparison grids. So that's one. The other thing is, again, yeah, it's really easy to keep your eye on the competition, but I think the best companies, they're closer to their customers than their competition. Intuit is a great example of that. I worked on the Quicken team. Before I got there, we competed directly with Microsoft, right? And we all kind of know that Microsoft can be a little slow to start. V1, V2 may not be that great, but by the time they get to V3, and that's not true for all their products, but for some, that was the kind of the joke going around, is by the time they got to V3, they were going to crush you, right? So they had like Microsoft Word had put WordPerfect out of business. IE had put Netscape out of business. So they were just like these business destroyers, right? When they got their momentum going. One of the main reasons that we continue to have like 80+% market share against them, I think, is because we focus a lot less on the competition and just focus on being as close to our customers as we can. And so that helped us really make sure we're creating customer value and helped us innovate. Because the other thing is when you're watching your competition, you're not innovating, right? You're just copying. At best, you're copying. And there's a presumption that they knew what they were doing when they built Feature X. Like they did all the research and they did all the innovation thought work, but the reality is they probably didn't. And so if you're just blindly copying people, you're not going to be innovating and you're probably not going to be delighting customers.
Yeah, I think that's a very important thing to remember. Just because a competitor has a feature doesn't necessarily mean it's something that delights the customers or something that's even useful for the customer.
Yeah, who knows how many of their users are even using it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Which we'll get to later. Like
yes, that's right.
Improve your product. But
yeah.
One final thing on prioritization before we move on, things change, right? So how should product managers handle it when priorities change?
Yeah, they definitely change. And so it's a funny thing. What I advise is, some people can just throw up their hands and say, gosh, this changes all the time anyway. Let's just not worry about it. And let's not keep track of it. I think it is important to keep an up-to-date list of rank order priorities, right? And the other thing is when you rank order is it helps you realize what's the top of the pyramid, what's the top of the list? Because we all know that items 20 through 50 on the backlog, we're probably never going to get to those. New items are going to come in sideways and push those down. We know how this goes, right? So having a prioritized list, a rank order list helps you focus on the top items. And then when priorities change, it's fine. You basically just update that rank ordered list and you say, this is, I'm sure many a PM who's listening to us today has been asked by an exec, hey, can we just get this one feature in? Hey, can we just get this one thing in, right? When we've already kind of done our resource allocation and planning. And so having that list can help say, yeah, sure, of course we can get in. Let's just pull up our list. And which one do you want to bump down? Where should this thing go on the list? Again, whenever you talk about any one idea in isolation, it sounds great, but it's all about relative prioritization. So having that list ready when somebody comes up with a proposal helps you go, okay, great. Where should it go? Should it be here? Oh, actually, no, it's not as important as that thing. It's not as important as that thing. It really goes here. So it can help facilitate those trade-off discussions.
Yeah, I think that's very important because you use can we fit this in? I've often been approached by, we are going to do this.
Oh, I know.
I can pull out that list and say, okay, we'll do this and it's going to take this level of effort. But that means, these 2-3 things that were a lower level of effort drop off. Because usually the thing we're going to do inevitably is a high level of effort too, right?
Of course.
So I think that's a great, coverage of the skill of prioritization and why it's important for PMs. Let's move on to connecting the big picture to all the tactical details. Talk to me about why that's an important skill for product managers.
Yeah, I found in my career, some people are really good at tactical details, like running the scrum ceremonies, like, sprint planning, sprint grooming, story pointing, writing stories, stand-ups, making sure the trains are leaving the station every 2 weeks with the right set of things. Some people are better at strategy, at the business school with some strategic consultants, they're really good at the 30,000 foot level, like, well, what should we be doing? Why are we doing this, right? And as a junior PM, it's natural earlier in your career to focus on tactics. You get thrown in on a scrum team, and your job is to do those activities that I just mentioned. And I think Agile also contributes to short-term. Agile is great because it got us out of kind of a waterfall mindset where we go a long time before we ship and iterate. But say you're doing 1 or 2 week sprints, you are on the treadmill. You're on the hamster wheel every 2 weeks and trying to keep up with the dev team. And just as this sprint's ending, you got to prep for the next one. So you can really be heads down in the weeds, in the tactical details, and not necessarily be connected with what's important overall, right? So, say your team has a really awesome velocity, you're shipping stuff very quickly, but the question then becomes, are you shipping the right things? Are you shipping the things back to prioritization that are going to create the most value? And as you get senior in your career, naturally, you need to spend more time on higher level thinking, bigger picture thinking, and also on, longer term thinking. And so that you make sure that, hey, when we go to do this sprint, we understand why we're doing it and how it makes sense with our big picture goals. And I would say the thing that made me really hone in on this skill is when at Intuit, I interviewed pretty much most of the PMs that were applying there when I was there. And, these are people from the top business schools. They're very smart. Everyone's very smart. Everyone had checked off most of the boxes of the skills and things you would expect for a PM. One of the things that ended up being the most differentiating was this. Could someone explain to me a big picture strategy and then translate it down into what that would mean for intermediate and tactical details of what we should do? So I think it's a very important skill. Good PMs are good at it, and especially the ones that grow to become product leaders become good at it.
So talk to me about what what product managers can do to focus more on that big picture.
Yeah, I think, one of the most important questions you can ask is why as a product manager. So many times, again, someone proposes, let's go build this feature, let's go do X, I think we should do Y. And especially if it's someone in a position of authority, you just kind of feel compelled to salute and say, yep, we'll go do that, right? Let's go take that hill. We'll take that hill. And so many times I've heard PMs say, well, I assume that person knows that it's going to have these impacts and these side effects and these ramifications and these trade-offs. But surprisingly, a lot of times they don't. So you should just be asking yourself a lot internally to yourself, not necessarily externally, but internally, why are we doing this? Why should we do this thing instead of that thing, right? So that you can focus also on product strategy. It's easy to just build things and ship things, but really answering the question, how are we going to be better and different than the competition? How are we going to beat them? This is where competitive analysis comes in, beyond just shipping things every 2 weeks, really having a point of view about how we stack up against the competition. Again, but not in a feature checklist standpoint, which of these actually matter to customers and which ones do we want to focus on? Market segmentation is another strategic activity. Instead of just building things, touching on something you said earlier, how do we get really clear on who our customer is, how we segment the market, and what their different needs and priorities are for different segments? Eventually, as a PM, you'll generate roadmaps. So roadmaps are a great way to kind of pull your head up from the sprint after sprint mentality. The funny thing there is sometimes I see people with roadmaps. I'm like, yeah, what do you do your roadmap in? They're like, oh, it's in Excel. And it's just a long list. I'm like, well, that's called the backlog. It's not really a roadmap. So for me, a roadmap is like a PowerPoint slide or a Google slide, like a one pager that really zooms out and shows for some material time frame, right? Like whether a year, depending on your industry, a year may be adequate for fast moving early stage startups. Maybe it's 2 years for longer term thing, but you're just taking a big picture view and not worrying about the little details. And then finally, when you do that, it naturally forces you to get alignment with key stakeholders. Within your Scrum team, you may be fairly autonomous and be able to get things done, but as you're moving up for bigger picture items and answering these important why questions, you're going to have to talk to, your cross-functional peers outside of the product team, marketing, sales. You're going to have to talk with more senior people. And again, I would say all these things, we spend a lot of time living in Jira, Confluence, and other tools, right? That it tends to be more summary level. Like I would just encourage people, to use slides to convey some of this information, like, Google Slides or PowerPoint or Keynote, where we just get out of the fray and we're able to just kind of start at the high level versus starting at the bottom level.
That's awesome advice. Other ideas on connecting the dots from big picture to day to day? I know we covered a lot there.
Yeah, we did. I mean, so it starts out by saying, what are our goals, right? Instead of just assuming somebody knows what the goals are and executing, just what are the goals? What are they? And you can ask your management for that. And if you don't get a clear answer, you can try to facilitate a process. The other thing is you need to get people aligned. Like obviously you may come up with a good idea of what we should be doing at a high level. You need to communicate it. And I know we do a lot of communication via Slack and email, but when we're talking about strategic things, higher level things, and trying to get buy-in, I think in-person works really well. Again, slides are very conducive to that. You can share your ideas and have a discussion with people. And then eventually you have to break it down into smaller pieces. And that's where, setting goals. So say you have an 18-month roadmap, you need to set monthly goals. You need to break it down to connect the dots from the big picture to the tactical. And that's where epics come in, for example, as opposed to stories, right? And you'll find that you have to reinforce it all the time, constantly at every meeting. Say, oh, we're doing that this sprint because remember in our roadmap and in our product strategy, this is important to customer segment X. Just reminding people again and again and focusing on why, new stuff's going to come up. And just asking why a lot. So when somebody proposes, and it's a very specific hack is when somebody says, say you've got your plan going and somebody says, oh, I think we should do X, and in your mind, it probably doesn't fit with strategies rather than just saying that doesn't fit with our strategies. be Socratic and just say, oh, it's an interesting idea. Which one of our big picture goals does that support? And if it is a good, if it maps back, then it kind of makes sense. If it doesn't map back to any strategic goal, then you can kind of say, oh, well, not saying it's not a good idea, but it just doesn't align with our goals. So it can be a helpful way to kind of have the team focus as well.
I think that's great. So we've talked about two things so far: prioritization and connecting the big picture to the details. Next, we want to talk about interviewing customers. Very important skill. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, and in general, just customer contact and building customer insight is important for product managers, right? I always like to remind people as PMs, we don't typically build the product. We're not coding it. The developers are, or the engineering team is building it. We don't design unless we have to. I like to say good PMs fill a void. So if you don't have a designer, maybe you're doing the wireframes or mockups, but in an ideally staffed team, there's a designer to do that. So we don't build it. We don't design it. What's our top responsibility? One of our top responsibilities is to be the expert on the market and the customers. At the end of the day, you should know more about your customers than anybody else on the team. And if you don't, then you should figure out a way to close that gap, because that's one of your main value adds as a PM. And so basically talking to customers just helps build that insight. And, we got back to these decisions about, hey, we need to prioritize, we need to set strategy. Well, we're not going to be making those in a vacuum. We need that customer insight to help inform those decisions on, what's important and what we need to be building to succeed in the marketplace. And I think we all know that for the most part, companies that are more customer centric do better. I just shared that Intuit example. There are plenty of examples out there too. Again, going back to problem-based solution space, the only way to really master this stuff is to really understand customer needs and benefits, and from there say what features should we be building. And there are numerous examples where people have like really good dev teams or design teams or technology, but they just weren't customer centric. They did more inside out development as opposed to outside in. And they failed. So again, at the end of the day, PMs need to be customer experts, and interviewing customers is a skill. You can just randomly talk to them, but interviewing them so that you get the most value when you do interact with them is a very valuable skill.
So talk to me about advice you give PMs you talk to on the process of interviewing the customers and things they can do. Yeah,
the number one thing is do it. A lot of people either don't do it, they don't talk to customers, or they say they talk to customers, but then you say, well, when's the last time you actually talked to a customer? And they can't really recall, right? A lot of times people fall into the proxy trap where it's like, well, sales told me the customer wants X, or customer success told me the customer wants X. And it's like the telephone game from when we were kids, right? And again, the number of times I've seen, especially like an enterprise company where the salesperson comes in and says, guys, I got this mega deal. You just build this. They told us they want us to build this, and we'll make millions of dollars. And so you go, you salute, you say, yes, sir. And you go build it, you launch it, and then they don't like it, they don't use it. And you realize because you never were clear on what their goals were or needs were, you just made the assumption that they knew that this thing was going to meet their goals. So again, by starting in solution space. So, the biggest thing, so people that want to be customer centric, one of the biggest challenges that I see is they're like, Dan, I would want to talk to customers, but we just don't have time. By the time we have the prototypes ready, or by the time we have the alpha ready, and if I try to go find some customers, then it's going to take me 3 weeks to find some customers, and like the train's going to leave the station. I'm not going to hold up the leash, right? So people fall into this trap of wanting to do it, but not being able to figure out how to work it into their process. And especially again with Agile, shipping every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 1 week, how do you make time for that? So the kind of different way of thinking about it that I've seen successful people do is just pre-schedule it, just set up like the first Thursday of every month or whatever it is, or, every other Wednesday, whatever it is, just slot in some customers and have someone else schedule them. So it's okay if you don't know yet what you're going to talk to them about. That's the trap. It's like, oh, we got to know what we're going to talk about and have the prototypes ready. The reality is by the time they come around, you just show them whatever you have. You're going to have something. You just don't know what it is yet right now, right? So that's the trap, way to get out of that trap, the scheduling trap. And the other thing I'll say is you hear more and more about research ops. And, PMs, we have to wear a lot of hats, right? If there's no designer, we're doing wireframes. If there's no QA, we're doing testing. Who has time to also coordinate research, right? So having a person, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a senior person, it can be a junior person, it can be part-time, just to deal with the logistics of scheduling those things can help a lot. I've been coaching a VP of product at a growing company, and they just added a research ops person, and it fundamentally changed the magnitude of customer interviews that they're doing, because now there's someone dedicated to just lining these interviews up. And that's their full-time job pretty much, as opposed to PMs trying to do it on the side.
Yeah, I think an important thing to emphasize that you said is block the time, for customers. And what I always did, and I recommend doing, is just block the time, even if you don't have any customers lined up. Because if it's not blocked on your schedule, we all know that like schedules get filled. It's like, oh, I saw you had a 3-hour block full, so we have this client, it's coming in, so we're going to give a roadmap presentation, right? Block the time. Otherwise, it gets filled. So don't worry as much about who it's going to be or what you're going to talk about. Block the time and then work to fill it. But if you don't block it, it's going to get filled.
Yeah, I like that defensive calendaring technique.
Defensive calendaring is super important.
Yeah, you gotta play defense, otherwise people play offense on you. Yeah, and that's at least another thing is sometimes with UX research is sometimes I find PMs like, oh, I don't have a degree in UX research. I've not done that. So there's like this intimidation factor, maybe also because people are shy or introverted or something, and they're just nervous about doing it. I strongly recommend that that PMs embrace talking to customers themselves. Again, that way there's no middle person, there's no telephone game, there's no translation going on. You're fortunate if you have a UX research group. There's pros and cons. The good news is they're really good at it. That's their full-time job. They're probably going to be able to talk to more people. But at the end of the day, they're going to have to translate their learnings to you. And there's always, I found a lot of times there's some information loss that happens there. Feeling it viscerally and hearing it firsthand is really good. So a mix of doing it yourself, and if you have a researcher, is really good. But it's like anything else. You'll get better as you practice it. And again, I've got some specific tips in my talks and books about how to do it. So, and it's really about listening. It's mainly about that. There's different scenarios. You may go talk to interviews with no agenda or like nothing to show them to get feedback on, and just what we would call more customer discovery to make sure you understand their current situation, what's important to them, what are they using now. Or you may go to them with mock-ups or a prototype or an alpha product, or a landing page or a PowerPoint or something where you're trying to get their feedback. But throughout all of that, the main goal is truly listening, active listening, and I know a lot of times PMs will have their their research guide and the questions they want to get through, and they're so anxious or nervous, they're just trying to power through those questions and they don't really listen. And the big moments happen actually when you get surprised. If everything goes according to plan, then you don't really learn anything. It's like, it just validates kind of what you already knew. So learning happens when you get surprised. So when a customer starts going off on a tangent or says, I don't care about that, but let me tell you about this, just be quiet and listen and let them go down that path. And the other thing is, a lot of times people just kind of nod and go, oh, okay. And they stop and move on to the next question. I would encourage people to dig deeper. When somebody a customer brings up something that seems valuable or interesting, they may only go so deep, but by probing and saying, oh, can you tell me more about that? That's the easiest question to pull out of your back pocket. Oh, can you tell me more about that? You'll get them to go deeper, and you'll probably find some good nuggets.
Yeah, I love the why questions. I mean, we could spend a whole hour, I think, on interviewing customers. Specific things you think people should avoid when interviewing customers.
Yeah, the main things real quick, it literally has to do with how you phrase the questions, like the words that you use, right? And the two main things you want to avoid, the number one thing is leading questions. If I've just shown you some, beta product and I go, that was easy to use, wasn't it? I pretty much set the customer up to say yes, right? Otherwise, they'd have to be.
You did a great job building this product, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. So that's, a leading question is when you have a desired answer in mind and you kind of put the answer in the question, or you kind of coerce the way the question is asked. It kind of coerces a person to go along with what you want, right? So we don't want to do that. And look, I mean, this is the interesting thing too. I mean, we're all human. When we work on a product, it's our baby. We want, it to do well when we test it with customers. But I think we need to maintain a level of objectivity and be more like a scientist in a lab and just try to, and it's hard. So sometimes maybe have someone else test your feature, so if you have trouble with that. But you want to get at the truth. Like, do they really like it or not? Like, you may be happy, like when they say, do you like it? And they say, yes, endorphins may go off in your brain, and you can go back to your boss and say, 8 out of 10 people liked it. Yay. It's like, but what did you learn? Like, what did you learn on how to make it better? Like what, again, back to the why question, what is the goal of this research? It's not to make yourself feel good. It's to learn, what do the customers really think about this? And even if they like it, you want to come out with ideas on how to make it even better or expand it or extend it. So that's the one thing. Questions are the worst. The other is close-ended, not as bad as leading, but close-ended. If I say to you, like after just testing out a feature, did you like that feature? What are the possible answers? The most likely answers are yes or no. So if you ask a yes or no question, they're going to say yes or no. And by the way, these interviews are a bit awkward for everybody, right? We don't normally sit around with a stranger asking them questions about some product they've never seen before, and grilling them about it. And so they're going to take the easy way out. Did you like it? Oh yeah. Yeah, cool. Are we done yet? Is it cool? They're going to take the easy way out, and you're hoping for that, because so the endorphins go off in your brain, right? So it's just like this superficial conversation. You like it? Yeah. Did it? Yeah. Okay, good. We're done. But again, if you reflect on it, what did you learn, right? We're not digging deeper. So rather than asking closed-end question, you should add an open-end question. So don't ask anything, that has, yes or no, or like specific answers. Ask a more open-ended question. What did you think about that feature? And what happens then is they can't take the easy way out and just say yes or no. They have to stop. They have to interpret your question. They have to reflect on what they saw over the last 10, 15 minutes, formulate a response, and give it back to you. And you get so much more valuable information when that happens. The other thing is, be okay with awkward pauses. You may ask someone, hey, what'd you think about that feature? They just saw this thing for the first time. It takes them a little while to process it, and so there can be this awkward pause while they're formulating their thoughts. And anxious product people, there's that awkward silence. Oh my God, awkward silence. I got to end it. Did you like this? They start throwing in answers. Did you like that? Did you like that? Did you like that? Did you like trying to guess the answer and fill in the blank for the customer? So just resist that urge, because again, you'll cut off their thinking and then just go, yeah, I did like that, and then move on.
So how often should product managers be talking to customers? I often talk to ones and they're like, oh, I talk to customers. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? They're like, well, we have, a group that gets together every quarter.
Yeah.
How often should PMs be talking to customers?
Yeah, it's tough to give a one-size-fits-all answer, obviously, but there's probably a minimum. And the way the easiest metric to look at is, how long has it been since you talked to the last customer, right? And I think certainly if it's been 2 or 3 weeks since the last time, that's probably too long. It'd be easy, motherhood and apple pie, and say, you should be talking to customers, once a week. And it kind of depends, I guess, on the stage that you're in. If you're in the earlier phases of the product cycle for a new product or feature, you should be talking to them more frequently, right? Maybe you need to be doing an interview a day to get the insight you need to inform, what you're going to build for that feature. And then when your head's down, designing it until you have a prototype. So maybe it kind of goes in waves of like, oh, intense, and then we get less intense, and then we get to the design phase. Once we have some mock-ups to show, then it gets intense again, right? And then it goes down. And then once we go into dev mode, we're doing that, and then we want to show them that. So it kind of goes in waves like that, but I think you should it's just a good habit. There's targeted customer research where you say, hey, we're building this one new feature, and we want to get either discovery research on it before we design it and define it, or we want to get, design research after we've got a mock-up or an alpha, right? That's kind of directed research. I think it's also good just to like bathe yourself in customers, and even when you don't have an agenda, just be like, hey, I'm just gonna every 2 or 3 weeks just make sure I'm touching base with customers, because you always get that kind of just random insights and things that you wouldn't otherwise get.
Well, let's move on from customers. There's so much more I want to ask you, but I can't. We have 2 more category areas to go through. So we've talked about customers, connecting big picture, and prioritization. Let's talk about using analytics to improve your product. And, are analytics an important skill for product managers? And I don't necessarily mean like, hey, you should write SQL queries, because I think they have teams to do that. But just, analytics at a high level, important for PMs?
Yeah, I think they are. I think they're growing in importance, and it's funny because I like to characterize, the realities. I think good product managers, they have 2 distinct muscles. There's qualitative muscles, what we just got done talking about, where you're good at talking to customers one-on-one and listening and extracting learning by listening and answering questions and probing the right way, right? That's kind of a qualitative muscle. And that's helpful. It's very valuable. You always need to be talking to customers, especially when you're trying to define a new product and do discovery. It's especially important. But then, after you launch your product, and you've got, users using it, analytics can be very useful. You can see, okay, what percentage of people are using this? Which features are they using? Which ones aren't they using, right? And that's a very quantitative approach. And I like to give each of those approaches. I like to personify each of them with a famous personality. So when I think of who's the master of talking to people one-on-one and really understand what makes them tick and getting them to open up, I think of Oprah Winfrey. So there's the Oprah technique is the qualitative. And then when I think about who's the master of like analytics and logic and things like that, it's Spock from Star Trek. So there's Oprah versus Spock. So I think it's important for PMs to build both of those. And I think that as the field of product management has evolved and grown, the role of analytics and the tools and the availability of data has just grown. And so I had this big epiphany at Intuit, actually, when I went from working on Quicken desktop software. We would do our best with both Oprah and Spock before the launch to figure out what customers wanted and what was the highest priority. Then we'd ship this CD-ROM in a box and then go out to the stores. And we got no usage data. We didn't get anything like it. We just got some high-level sales reports, a month after the fact that we sold this many units or this many units. No real actionable product feedback to say, oh, they like this or not. Now, we obviously would try to mitigate that by doing user surveys and things like that, but no real actual usage data. I went straight from that to a web product that we launched. And like the day we launched it, the next day we showed up work and said, how many people did X? How many people did Y? And the engineer said, let me go look in the data. And we got all these answers like, whoa. And so the answers to those questions begat other questions like, what about this? What about this? And we just found like as a manager and someone trying to innovate and iterate, having access to that data and being able to ask new questions and getting new data really accelerated our ability to innovate. So I think it is important. The other thing I would say, not to scare people, but from a competitive standpoint, chances are your competitors are pretty good at analytics. So it's like, who's better at this? It's a skill that companies that are really good at this can use that information to iterate and innovate more quickly, right? And if you think about, we talk about, development velocity, think about your analytics or learning velocity or learning from analytics velocity. It can be a major competitive force to accelerate your timelines against your competitors.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I used to pull things up like, show me all the people that are using this feature because I want to talk to them and get feedback. It was a way to guide customer interviews. Or show me people that have given us a 6 NPS so I can ask them, what would it take to get to an 8 or a 9, right? From that 6. Tell me.
No, and you just brought up an awesome point, which is, some people favor quant or some people favor qual. They're both valuable. And oftentimes you need to correlate between the two. We in some of the examples I share in my talks, it's like we see this conversion funnel and we see a big drop off. So we know this is where most people are dropping off. We have no idea why. So like you said, that's the smoke that makes us then say, okay, let's go talk to people that are dropping off to figure out the whys behind it, right? Definitely.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit more about how the best PMs are using analytics.
Yeah, I think it's, in a lot of skills or areas, there's like a maturity model that comes to mind. Like, hey, some people aren't doing anything. And then like the baby step is this, and then you can work up, and then world-class people are doing this. That's how I think about analytics. And level 1 is just, are you tracking it? Do you have an analytics system in place? Have you identified your key metrics? Are you tracking them? Are you seeing what's going on? Like literally, do you have visibility into the metrics? And one bump along the road there is what I call data hygiene that can happen. Is like, you think you're tracking something, but then you realize the numbers don't make sense, and you realize, oh, the way we instrumented that isn't quite right, or we didn't define the metric as clearly as we thought. So once you get to that baseline of tracking your key metrics, that's an important part where, there's no more of this, whoa, what's going on with this key metric? And people go, I don't know, we don't have the data. So when you get to the point where you've got the data and people believe it, and it's, I think it's also important that the data is democratized and it's transparent. Like anybody on the product team can go and see these metrics at any point in time. That's very valuable versus kind of an older school model where you've got a data team and they're the only ones that can like get the data out of the system, and you've got to go to them with your request, and then you wait a week, and so we wanted to just be transparent. That again accelerates everyone's velocity and timeline. And then finally, I think once you have that baseline, you then get to the point where each team is really clear on what are the 1 or 2 metrics that we're responsible for improving. And again, back to our first point, that we're clear on how they're tied back to our big picture goals. Like as a business, we're trying to achieve X. That means my product team needs to move the needle on these 2 metrics. And we've got a transparent dashboard where we can see that as we try new product ideas, we can see what's going on. So So that's what I see, the better teams doing. And then beyond that, the really good teams are expanding into A/B testing and experimentation and kind of a more formal framework for that. But even if you get to the level that I said, that's pretty good and will enable you to make much more better informed product decisions.
Yeah, one of the challenges before we move on from analytics to working with functions, one of the challenges I always see is like making sure you're capturing the data. Instrumentation's hard with engineers. So if you can we're blessed at Pendo that we instrument everything. If you can work with a software company that helps you instrument everything, then you don't have to know what data you need in advance. That usage data is going to be there for you. So now we've covered 4 areas: analytics, interviewing customers, connecting big picture, prioritization. Our 5th and final area, and I feel like we could spend a whole day on this.
I know.
Dan Olsen extended version. But our 5th and final area today before we go to Q&A, working across multiple functions, right?
Yeah.
And coordinating network. So talk to me about why cross-functional coordination is an important skill for product managers.
Yeah, now I find myself asking why. Like, why do we pick 5 topics? We drew the cut line 1 too low. Maybe we should have done 4, but let's get into this one. So coordinating work across multiple functions. I think this is really important. Again, we don't build things or design things ourselves. And in a sense, each of the functional teams kind of speaks their own language and has their own perspective. When I think of PMs, I think of like a United Nations translator or something. You're sitting there and everyone, all the different countries are speaking the different languages and you're in the middle a little bit, right? So that's part of it. Is just, I like to say product development is a team sport, although we never, wear jerseys in practice or anything like that. They just throw us in the mix. So, our job a lot of times is like the informal coordinator or the glue or the communication conduit, right? To just coordinate the efforts of these people that otherwise would not be coordinated. And there's there's engineering and design, obviously, that we work closely with in our sprints, research, marketing and sales, other business functions, support and service, legal. There's a bunch of functions that we need to work with and coordinate. And the interesting thing, actually, I haven't thought about this before, is no one has an expectation for any of those other functions to coordinate across functions, right? There's zero expectation. Nobody goes to the legal person, hey, why didn't you check with Dev? What happened? Like, nobody does that, So I guess the short answer is it wouldn't happen if PMs don't do it, which is often the answer for things that PMs do, I guess. So it's just really important because it truly takes a village to launch a product. No one rockstar dev or rockstar designer or rockstar marketer can do all the end-to-end activities that are required to get a world-class product out the door. So it's got to be coordinated. And like I like to say, nobody reports to us, but it's our job for coordinating all their efforts and influencing and getting things done.
So let's lay that out, because it was hidden in that answer. Who should product managers be coordinating with? And maybe it's a question of, is there anyone they shouldn't be? I feel like the product managers, in front of the orchestra, making things are smooth.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. We're the CEO of the product, so everybody has to do what we say, right? So,
yeah, if only that was the case. I'm
joking. There's a lot of good discussion on the CEO or not, the metaphor. So we are orchestrating. I think the challenge, again, goes down to prioritization. There's so many functional groups. So it's like, for what we're trying to accomplish right now, who are the groups that most need to be coordinated, right? And it just depends on kind of where you're at in that phase. Obviously, day-to-day sprint, active development, engineering and design is really important. If you're trying to do more discovery, then maybe getting input from marketing and sales becomes more valuable at that point. If you're approaching launch, if it's like, hey, we're coming up for air and this thing's about ready to go, then obviously coordinating with marketing and sales is more important. So it kind of depends on which phase of the life cycle you're in, I guess. And you just got to prioritize, because you could spend. That's the challenge. One of the challenging things about the PM job is whether it's talking to customers or competitive analysis or grooming your backlog or prioritization, you could never sleep and just keep doing it and it would never be over. So you have to set the cut lines for yourself across those different activities that you have to do. And back to the prioritization discussion, you have to figure out, okay, how much customer interview should I be doing? How much coordinating with these people should I be doing? How much this should I be doing, right? And so it'll vary depending on the product cycle. And I think just a kind of a telltale that, how do you get feedback that you maybe should be doing more? Chances are you're probably not doing too much. I guess you could, be a professional facilitator, but chances are you're not doing too much. A telltale sign would be that people aren't on the same page, right? Marketing isn't quite clear on what this product is or why we're building it, or this other engineering team you need support from doesn't understand why it's a priority. Things like that. When there are disconnects, then that's like a smoke signal that you probably need to spend more time coordinating.
Advice on how PM should be coordinating with everybody?
Yeah, this is tough. So I think that everybody falls back to Slack or email. I think, and you got to figure out the right mix here. And it's also, I think we all know, like, you can't just get buy-in by emailing a whole group. Everyone's not just going to magically agree. So sometimes you have to talk to people one-on-one or in smaller groups. The model that I like a lot is what I call the concentric circle model. And this is where you basically, there are models out there like DACY and RACY that can be helpful, where you just say, who are the key people I need to get buy-in on? And like, say it's the chief architect, you're doing some new big platform feature or something. Rather than calling a meeting with him and the designer and the marketing person, all this jazz, and trying to get everybody bought in at once, I would go just meet one-on-one with the architect, make sure that I understand his concerns and questions, start to float my idea. This literally happened at one of my startup clients the other day. I was joking with my senior PM. I'm like, you got a caucus, man. I'm like, you got a caucus. You got to go meet that guy and caucus with him. And then you got to go over here and caucus with him. It's a little bit of that kind of building a coalition and getting people on board. So I think, a lot of times that just has to be, especially if it's a contentious issue or different functions have different points of view on it, in-person can help. So I think you got to find the right mix of in-person versus online, and phone is another option, obviously, but the fidelity of communication you can have, phone or in-person, is important. So just figuring out the right way to do it for the right, based on the particular situation.
Yeah, one of the things that amazed me, going back to some of the study work that we sponsor with Product Collective at Pendo, was that there wasn't a lot of alignment between product management and engineering, that they cited that as an area where there was, little might be an exaggeration, but less alignment than a lot of the other areas, right? So what advice would you give PMs there? How can they get better aligned with the engineering groups?
Yeah, I mean, and some of it, so if I had to reverse engineer what would lead to more disconnect versus less disconnect, some of it is org structure, right? I mean, it's not, sometimes you have places where PM and engineering eventually report to the same executive before it gets to the CEO. It's not that common, but it does happen. Versus, no, we have a head of engineering and head of PM and they don't report in, or even where PM's underneath the COO or marketing or some other department. So if you think about kind of the distance in the org chart, that can lead to disconnects. Not always, but it can be a predictor of more or less disconnect. That's one thing. The other thing is just like culturally, this gets back to cross-functional coordination, and if you think about, I always like to reference the Venn diagram, which is like the logo for my meetup, of like a 3 circles that overlap, and one is PM, one is dev, and one is design, right? When things are going well, those circles have a pretty good intersect area, but in some places they don't intersect, it's just 3 separate circles, and those are basically silos. And so a lot of times I think if you've got a big disconnect between engineering and PM, it's because people are working in silos. They may or may not be doing Agile. A lot of times they're not doing Agile. It's like the old school way of waterfall, of we write a big PRD, PM spends a lot of time on this marketing PRD, on this PRD, and then we just throw it over the fence to engineering and expect them to interpret it and build it. And there's not actually a lot of collaboration going on. And that's just, and it's usually just because that's the way the company does it. As we know, that's not how modern product teams do it. Modern product teams embrace a cross-functional collaboration so that, as we're defining the product, our engineering leads and our design leads are involved in that process. I always think of it like a baton race. Like, yeah, we're running the first leg, but it's a team effort. We may be driving the initiatives. We don't get to make all the decisions, but we're driving it in the first phase of defining what it is. We hand the baton to design. They drive that phase, and then when we're ready and we've got validation to code, then we hand the baton to dev. But at every phase, even though one person has the baton, the other 2 are involved, right? So A lot of it can be also just a lack of a forum. You know, a lot of times I'll go in and help with clients and they're missing some key meeting. I'm like, you know, no wonder these two teams are disconnected because nobody said this is a problem. Let's set up a recurring meeting or even an ad hoc meeting. You know, I find a lot of times people are reluctant to add a new meeting. They don't feel like they have the power to do it, or maybe they just don't realize the need for it, or also kill meetings for what it's worth, you know, that aren't useful anymore. But
yeah, or even just not attend meetings where it's not as important for them to be there, but
yeah,
be invited to them so that it's more collaborative, and maybe they're just in part of that. But I always find it really effective when design, engineering, and product management are collaborating on coming up with solutions to problems, as opposed to throwing stuff over the wall, so to speak.
Yeah, and I guess I haven't thought about this. I'm gonna use this term as like communication design, being deliberate about communication design. Like, how do we communicate these things? And one other random thing is, do you ever have like an all hands meeting with product and engineering together? You know, where we're talking together. I know the value of people hearing the same thing at the same time is just huge, and we're constantly all running around working with one-on-one or little group communications, but getting everybody together and saying, here's our roadmap for the quarter, here's our objectives for the year, here's why we're doing this, can help get everybody bought in and rolling in the same direction.
Well, let's jump into some of the questions. I know we have a little less than 10 minutes left now. There's some interesting questions. I was thinking about this when we were talking a little bit about time to interview customers. You know, Bill was asking how you describe the distinction between product manager and product owner. You want to take that one, Dan?
Sure. There's a lot of good discussion out there. So if you just
like a bit to add my little part in.
All right, cool. If you just snap your fingers and like made Agile disappear and the whole concept of a Scrum Master and PO disappear, there would still be PMs, right? That's the first place I like to start is PMs or product managers. Our job is to do, you know, all the things like, you know, our job is to know the market, be experts on the customers, figure out the product strategy, define the roadmap, define the features, write up the user stories, work with engineering and design on those activities, right? That a PM, that's the full PM, and then work with marketing. So the list goes on and on. So that PM is the job independent of POs existing. Right now, if you snap your fingers again, you say, okay, we've got Agile back and we have POs now. What do they do? Like anything in the real world, the answer is it depends on where you're at. But I think that the commonality is most POs, when someone says PO, they're usually referring to the activities that are involved with sprints and working with dev, basically, and design to a lesser extent. Right? That's what a PO is, a product owner. My job is to make sure that I've got a backlog, it's groomed, and running that process. So that's the core of a PO. And then what happens at different companies, it gets fuzzy because there's an intersection between PO and PM. In my view of PM, PO is subsumed by PM. PO is a little circle inside of a PM circle. That's how I view it. Now, in some companies, they choose to split those things. And when you split out PO, and you don't take my point of view, and you split it out from the PM circle, then the argument goes like this. Well, you know, running the sprint stuff takes so much time that we need people dedicated to that. We're going to call them POs. And these people we're going to call PMs, and they don't have to do that sprint stuff because they need time to do the things I was talking about. Like, hey, how do we get strategic? Or how do we, you know, these people over here are getting sucked into the sprint stuff and they don't have time to lift their head up and go innovate and talk to customers and things like that, right? So we need to free people up who have time to do that. That's fine. Kind of makes sense. The challenge is oftentimes those two groups of people don't coordinate well enough. So you end up, these people go off and they come up with these ideas and they throw them over the silo to these people. And the people on the product team goes, what's this? We weren't involved in this. We don't know what this is. We have other priorities to do. So that's the con. There's pros and cons. There's no one right answer, but that's how I see PO versus PM. But I'd love to hear your take, Eric.
Yeah, I'm going to be really quick because I know we got a lot of questions. Right. But I would just say the one thing as a product manager you don't want to have happen is the fact that you're saying, oh, I can't talk to customers or I can't go on this trip to meet customers because I have a dev meeting every morning that I have to be in, right? That's a concern. Because really you're a development manager or maybe a product owner.
Scrum Master, yeah. That's a good point. If the devs are your customers, the dev team's your customers, then yeah, you're not a PM, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in a dev-centric or engineering-centric organization, it's possible to get sucked into being that person.
Right.
So fight that. Another question we have around prioritization that came in from Laura. How how do you prioritize regarding technical issues? Like when there's testing quality issues, I assume like bug issues versus new features.
Yeah.
How do you work that in?
Yeah. So that's more, again, I mentioned a portfolio approach briefly. The reality is, yeah, you do need it. You can look at it a different way, which is, okay, we have a certain bug backlog. We have a tech debt backlog. We have enhancements backlog of existing features. We have new features and new products, right? We've got these high level buckets. Obviously, if we're constantly just doing new features and stuff, the tech debt's going to get us and the bugs are going to get us, and right, not enhancing stuff. So you've got to strike a balance between building new things and improving what you've built until it gets to the point where, it's better off. We all know when you launch a V1 product, it's going to have bugs and issues and things that are missing and things like that. So you got to strike a balance. And I personally think it's best to strike a balance on an ongoing, I think steady state. I think a lot about steady state, right? And actually in that sense, sprint is an ironic word because you can't be sprinting forever. You're eventually going to run out of breath. So we should be marathoning instead of sprinting, right? But, so what percentage, like every sprint, and it doesn't have to be every sprint, but in general, 10 or 15% of the resources go to bugs or so-and-so goes to tech debt. The other way people do it is they go new dev, new dev, new dev, new dev. Oh my gosh, the house is about to crash down. We need to switch completely to tech debt and refactoring and bugs, right? So it's like schizophrenic. We're either all in on one or all in on the other. So I think I would encourage people to try to strike a balance. Obviously, it's okay every once in a while. And it goes in cycles. If you launch a new feature, you should spend some time after you launch it on, bugs, UX improvements, enhancements after you listen to customers. You shouldn't just roll right into the next big 100% of your team in the next big feature because we know that it needs to be optimized and improved. So I think it goes in cycles, and just don't, if you're thrashing from one end of the spectrum to the other, that's not a good sign.
Yeah. And I would add to that too. I mean, I love your matrix, like level of effort versus value, the high, medium, low, or even very high. I took that matrix and then I'd label them and I'd be like, oh, this is, this feature is a bug feature. This feature is a competitive feature. This feature is a key differentiator. And then you could roll it up when you have, a release, so to speak, or a sprint.
Right.
You realize that I'm not doing anything for new functionality, right? It's a lot of bugs. It's a lot of maintenance releases, which is okay. I mean, I have a product, I host a product podcast called Product Love. We had a guy from an ex-Microsoft PM. He said one of their best releases ever turned out to be primarily just a bug release where they just improved on existing things, didn't do anything radically different, and it had the best customer feedback. So that's not a bad thing, but you just have to be cognizant of what you're doing, right? You should have the visibility into, okay, this sprint or this release or however you're structuring things is going to be all based in this area, or here's the breakdown between these different areas, bugs, maintenance, competition, new differentiators, or whole new product areas.
I think that's a great point. And I think that, the other thing, when you do take a portfolio approach, you're talking about resource allocation at a high level, a desired resource allocation. Very rarely do people then go and look at what it actually was. Okay, great. We said we wanted to spend 20% on tech debt or whatever. Over the last month or quarter, what did we actually do? It's kind of like your asset allocation for portfolio. It's like, yeah, I should be 70% bonds or 70% stocks. Am I or not? And it's that extra little step. If you're tagging, if you've got your issue types set up right, like bug versus enhancement versus a new feature, or you're using tags right, it's easy to do retrospectively a quick report and say, oh, we said X, but we actually voted with our resources this other way. Let's course correct for the next cycle, basically.
Yeah, or at least be cognizant about it. Make sure it's one thing to do the retrospective and realize we set out to do this and we didn't. And there might be a good reason for that, but make sure you're aware that you didn't do what you're setting out to do, and not just put blinders on. So I think that answered some of Beth's questions. How do you recommend handling prioritization for new development versus maintenance? And I think as Dan said, you split up time and you label things and figure out, okay, how much is going to what area, and make sure people are comfortable with that. Do a retrospective to look at it. We have a question from Rohan here. He wants some career advice. Wanted to say, how do you think about moving from a tactical junior PM to that strategic senior PM? What advice would you give him?
Yeah, I was very fortunate in my career at Intuit. My GM didn't backfill a position between me and him. And as a result, I got to go to his staff meetings. So part of it is just exposure to the next level up, whether it's directly in PM or engineering management or design management. It's kind of getting exposure to those. There might be a set of meetings that you're not in, and obviously you're not going to jump in those meetings and be like, well, actually, I think we should do X, but you can listen in. And so just kind of being a sponge and absorbing. I think one-on-ones, obviously one-on-ones with your manager, make sure that you're not spending all the time just on the to-do list. Carve out some portion of that time for what we call growth and development, where you can have a discussion. I actually, at Intuit, we had what we call a skills matrix, which is to say, to move from this level to this level, like every company, we had the HR levels, to go from a PM to a senior PM. What does that mean? We actually had a document that we created, and I occasionally help my clients with that. So there are a couple of those floating around on the internet. You don't see a lot of them, but just like what are, this today's talk is about skills. So just having a point of view about what are the skills that are important for a PM, which ones am I already good at, which ones do I want to grow at, and having explicit discussions and setting up, finding projects, finding side projects or things where you can help out. Say you want to get better at design. Well, go find someone on the design team that's overly busy and offer to help them with their wireframes or help them with their user research or something like that. So I think once you're clear on the skill gaps you want to close or skills you want to extend, then you can go out and find people or projects to help you do that.
Awesome. Well, I know we have more questions, but we're also now, I think, 2 minutes over. So I think we're going to end this. I know we're going to try to follow up with people that did have specific questions. We're going to try to get answers for you and follow up directly. So if your question didn't get answered, you should get an email from us. And if not, feel free to just reach out, shoot us an email saying, Eric or Dan, both of us, I really want to know an answer to this question. It's keeping me up at night.
Yeah, and I have a lot of videos on my website, dan-olsen.com. So there probably some of the questions might be answered by some of the videos there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dan. I greatly enjoyed this. I could have gone for at least another hour, Definitely. But some other time.
Sounds great, Eric. Thanks. It's been awesome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.